Hello dear viewers, this is Amaloti and today we are going to study the Restoration period which began in 1660 and continued up to the 1700. After the Restoration in 1660 when Charles II came to the throne, there was a complete repudiation of the Puritan ideals and way of living. In English literature, the period from 1660 to 17 is called the period of Restoration because monarchy was restored in England, and Charles II, the son of Charles I, who had been defeated and beheaded, came back to England from his exile in France and became the king. It is called the Age of Dryden because the Dryden was the dominating and most representative literary figure of the age. As the Puritans who were previously controlling the country and were supervising her literary and moral and social standards were finally defeated, a reaction was launched against whatever they held sacred. All restraints and discipline were thrown to the winds, and a wave of licentiousness and frivolity swept the country. Charles II and his followers, who had enjoyed a gay life in France during their exile, did their best to introduce that type of foppery and looseness in England also. They renounced the old ideal and demanded that English poetry and drama should follow the style to which they had become accustomed in the gaiety of Paris. Instead of having Shakespeare and the Elizabethan as their models, the poets and dramatists of the Restoration period began to imitate French writers and especially their voices. The result was that the old Elizabethan spirit, with its patriotism and its love of adventure and romance, its creative vigor, and the Puritan spirit, with its moral discipline and love of liberty, became things of the past. For a time in poetry, drama, and prose, nothing was produced which could compare satisfactorily with the great achievements of the Elizabethans of Milton and even of minor writers of the Puritan age. But then the writers of the period began to evolve something that was characteristic of the time, and they made two important contributions to the English literature in the form of realism and a tendency to preciseness. In the beginning, realism took an ugly shape because the writers painted the real picture of the corrupt society and court. They were more concerned with the vices rather than with virtues. The result was a coarse and inferior type of literature. Later, this tendency to realism became more wholesome, and the writers tried to portray realistically human life as they found it, its good as well as bad side, its internal as well as external shape. The tendency to preciseness, which ultimately became the chief characteristics of the Restoration period, made a lasting contribution to English literature. It emphasized directness and simplicity of expression and counteracted the tendency of exaggeration and extravagance which was encouraged during the Elizabethan and the Puritan ages. The Restoration writers, under the influence of French writers, gave emphasis to reasoning rather than romantic fancy, and evolved an exact and precise way of writing consisting of short, clear-cut sentences without any unnecessary word. Dryden accepted his directness, preciseness, and reasoning for his prose and for his poetry, and adopted the easiest way of verse form, the heroic couplet. Under the guidance, the English writers evolved a style precise, formal, and elegant. Literary genres which we find in this period are Restoration poetry, drama, and prose. Dryden was the dominating figure of the Restoration period, and he made his mark in the fields of poetry, drama, and prose. In the field of poetry, Dryden was in fact the only poet worth mentioning. In his youth, he came under the influence of Cole, and his early poetry has the characteristic conceits and exaggeration of the metaphysical school. But in his later years, he emancipated himself from the false taste and artificial style of the metaphysical writers and wrote in a clear and forceful style which laid the foundation of the classical school of poetry in England. The poetry of Dryden can be conveniently divided under three heads: political style, doctrinal poems, and the fables. Of his political stars, Absalom and Achitophel and the Medal are well known. In Absalom and Achitophel, which is one of the greatest political stars in the English language, Dryden defended the king against the Earl of Shaftesbury, who is represented as Achitophel. The Medal is another satirical poem full of invective against Shaftesbury and Meg Falconer. It also contains a scathing personal attack on Thomas Shadwell, who was once a friend of Dryden. The two great doctrinal poems of Dryden are Religio Laici and The Hind and the Panther. These poems are neither religious nor devotional, but theological and controversial. Dryden wrote Religio Laici when he was Protestant, and it defends the Anglican Church. The Hind and the Panther was written when Dryden had become a Catholic, vehemently defends Catholicism. The fables, which were written during the last years of Dryden's life, show no decrease in his poetic power. Written in the form of a narrative, they entitle Dryden to rank among the best storytellers in verse in England. The Palamon and Arcite, which is based on Chaucer's Knight's Tale, gives us an opportunity of comparing the method and art of a 14th century poet with one belonging to the 17th century. Of the many miscellaneous poems of Dryden, Annus Mirabilis is a fine example of his sustained narrative power. His Alexander's Feast is one of the best odes in the English language. The poetry of Dryden possesses all the characteristics of the Restoration period, and is therefore thoroughly representative of that age. It doesn't have the poetic glow, the spiritual fervor, the moral loftiness, and philosophical depth which were sadly lacking in the Restoration period. But it has the formalism, the intellectual precision, the argumentative skill, and realism which were the main characteristics of that age. Though Dryden doesn't reach great poetic heights, yet here and there he gives us passages of wonderful strength and eloquence. His reputation lies in his being great as a stylist and reasoner in verse. In fact, in these two capacities, he is still the greatest master in English literature. Dryden's greatest contribution to English poetry was his skillful use of the heroic couplet, which became the accepted measure of serious English poetry for many years. In 1642, the theatres were closed by the authority of the Parliament, which was dominated by Puritans, and so no good plays were written from 1642 till the Restoration, or coming back of the monarchy in England with the accession of Charles II to the throne in 1660, when the theatres were reopened. The drama in England after 1660, called the Restoration drama, showed entirely new trends on account of the long break with the past. Moreover, drama was greatly affected by the spirit of the New Age, which was deficient in poetic feeling, imagination, and emotional approach to life, but laid emphasis on prose as the medium of expression and intellectual, realistic, and critical approach to life and its problem. As the common people, still under the influence of Puritanism, had no love for the theatres, the dramatists had to cater to the taste of the aristocratic class, which was highly fashionable, frivolous, cynical, and sophisticated. The result was that, unlike the Elizabethan drama, which had the mass appeal, had its roots in the life of the common people, and could be legitimately called the national drama, the Restoration drama had none of these characteristics. Its appeal was confined to the upper strata of society, whose taste was aristocratic and among which the prevailing fashions and etiquettes were foreign and extravagant. As imagination and poetic feelings were regarded as vulgar enthusiasm by the dictators of the social life, but as actual life meant the life of the aristocratic class only, the plays of this period do not give us a picture of the whole nation. The most popular form of drama was the comedy of manners, which portrayed the sophisticated life of the dominant class of society, its gaiety, foppery, insolence, and intrigue. Thus, the basis of the Restoration drama was very narrow. Comedy loses its ideal universality, wit succeeds humor, we laugh from self-complacency and triumph, instead of bare malignity, sarcasm, and contempt succeed to a sympathetic merriment, we hardly laugh but we smile. Obscenity, which is ever blasphemy against the divine beauty of life, becomes, from the very veil which it assumes, more active if less disgusting. It is a monster for which the corruption of society forever brings forth new food which it devours in secret. These new trends in comedy are seen in Dryden's Wild Gallant, Etheridge's The Comical Revenge or Love in a Tub, Wycherley's The Country Wife and the Plain Dealer, and the plays of Wamberg and Furger. But the most gifted among all the Restoration dramatists was William Congreve, who wrote all his best plays when he was 30 years of age. His well-known comedies are Love for Love and The Way of the World. The Restoration period was deficient in poetry and drama, but in prose it holds its head much higher. During the Restoration period, English prose was developed as a medium for expressing clearly and precisely average ideas and feelings about the miscellaneous matters for which prose is really meant. The elaborate Elizabethan prose was unsuited to telling a plain story. The epigrammatic style of Bacon, the grandiloquent prose of Milton, and the dreamy harmonies of Browne could not be adapted to scientific, historical, political, and philosophical writings, and above all to novel writing. Thus, with the change in the temper of the people, a new type of prose, as was developed in the Restoration period, was essential. As in the fields of poetry and drama, Dryden was also the chief leader and practitioner of the new prose. In his grotesque critical work, Essay of Dramatic Poesy, Dryden presented a model of the new prose, which was completely different from the prose of Bacon, Milton, and Browne. He wrote in a plain, simple, and exact style free from all exaggerations. Other writers of the period who came under the influence of Dryden and wrote in a plain, simple but precise style were Sir William Temple, John Thelliston, and George Saville better known as Viscount Halifax. Another famous writer of the period was Thomas Sprat, who wrote History of the Royal Society. Next to the Dryden, Bunyan was the greatest prose writer of the period. Bunyan was the greatest storyteller. To him also goes the credit of being the precursor of the English novel. His greatest work is The Pilgrim's Progress. Just as Milton wrote his Paradise Lost to justify the ways to go to men, Bunyan's aim in The Pilgrim's Progress was to lead men and women into God's way, the way of salvation, through a simple parable with homely characters and exciting events. The Pilgrim's Progress has all the basic requirements of the traditional type of English novel. So this is why the John Bunyan is well known as the precursors of English novel, because the novel was recognized first during 18th century as a distinct and new genre of English literature. So this was the literature of 17th century. We will be right back with the new topic of 18th century literature. Goodbye.